Hello. Walk down any busy high street and the chances are within a few minutes you will pass several people with depression. Now, some of them might be receiving medical treatment, others may simply be feeling ashamed and even guilty that they can't seem to cope with life. And in fact, it's only in recent times that attitudes towards depression have started to change. Only really in the last few decades have non-medical people like me, and possibly you, started to realise that depression is an illness just like any other, and you can't simply pull yourself together. For Christians, though, depression can often be regarded as a breakdown of faith, and within the church it's often treated as a spiritual problem, one that can be cured with more prayer and more Bible reading. In other words, for many Christians, depression is just a state of mind that you should be able to pull yourself out of. But are they right? Well, in this series of 4 video workshops, general practitioner, author and broadcaster Dr. John Lockley will be opening up the whole subject of depression and in particular how it affects Christians. The video workshops are based on his best-selling book, A Practical Workbook for the Depressed Christian, which accompanies the series. He begins the first one by explaining how he got interested in the subject.
Welcome everybody to this seminar on Christians and depression. I'm John Lockley. I'm a GP. I've been a Christian since 1962. I was converted at a Billy Graham crusade in Manchester City's football ground, which is a bit of a pity because I'm a United supporter, but you can't have everything. But seriously, it was a good day, the day I got converted. What wasn't such a good day was about 4 or 5 years later, when I went up to university to be a medical student, and I suddenly got very, very depressed. And when I was being very, very depressed, some people could help me. Others didn't quite get the idea. And the sad thing was that a lot of the people who hadn't quite got the idea were actually in the church. And they said things to me that unfortunately didn't always help. I worked through it. It took a long time, probably about 3 years at the really worst part, and 6 years more or less in all. But I learned a lot of lessons in that time. Lessons that I felt that I could perhaps pass on to other people at some time in the future. About 20 years later, one of my patients, who was also a friend, who was also a fellow church member, also got depressed. And I could see the same things happening to her as had been happening to me. That while there had been some people who were absolutely gloriously helpful, there were others who were trying to be helpful. They were in the church, but they didn't quite get it right. Their heart was in the right place, but unfortunately what they said didn't really help at all. And in some cases it really hurt. And I thought at the time, this is very sad. This was the time when people in the secular world were learning that you don't say to people with depression, "No, just snap out of it. Come on, pull yourself together." And the lay world had learned that. The Christian world hadn't quite learned the equivalent, which is you ought to pray more, or what's the matter with your faith? Those are things that shouldn't be said to people who are depressed. And I could see it happening. So what happened was that I started to try and help her. And one of the things I thought of doing was writing down a few notes from what had happened to me when I had personally been depressed in the past. And she said, "Well, I used to be a secretary. I used to be a secretary with a publishing company. Why don't you dictate it and I'll type it out and it will be good for me? Because I'll get it through my head and I'll get it through my fingers and I'll learn it on the way." So we did that. And out came the book, A Practical Workbook for the Depressed Christian. One of the things I'm going to be talking about today is how Christians can unfortunately make things worse. Now, in saying that, I don't mean to be in any way insulting to the church, and I certainly don't mean to be insulting to Christianity itself. What I want us to understand very, very firmly is that there are ways to help people and there are ways not to help people, and it's purely a matter of learning. The church working well is the best place for anybody who is depressed, without a shadow of doubt. the church working badly can make things a whole lot worse. We need to learn how to help. So my comments are not meant to be critical of the church. I can't emphasize enough that depression in Christians is slightly different to depression in people who are not involved in the church, because there are special worries, troubles, stresses and strains that Christians face that people who are not in the church do not face. There is always a feeling about a Christian that he's got to portray God, he's got to be God's agent, God's messenger, and that he's got to witness to other people. And that puts a huge stress on people. It's not a stress that he or she should be bearing, but it's a very easy mistake to make. There are also stresses because by the very nature of the Christian life, we are called to be different and called out from the world. That brings its own stresses and strains. And so the vicar, who is valiantly portraying and living Christ's message in a village where perhaps he has got very few people to support him, may be under intense stress locally because he's seen to be the pillar of the community, seen to be the representative of Christ on earth, and maybe he doesn't feel up to the job. So being in the church doesn't guarantee that you're going to be immune from depression. Very important. What is depression? Well, let's talk about the symptoms. Depression is not an easy subject to define. There are a whole gamut of things that are related to it. You can't look at a particular person and say they're definitely depressed because they've got that symptom, because another person who is definitely depressed may not have that symptom at all. He or she may have other symptoms. But let's look at some of the main symptoms. The ones in yellow are the ones that I think are perhaps the most important ones. Firstly, there's a sense of tiredness, a sense of lethargy, a sense of hopelessness, of the uselessness of everything. Often you get sleeping problems, particularly, in my experience, early waking. The person who goes to sleep, maybe with some difficulty, and then wakes 1 or 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, and they are tired out, but their eyes are wide open. They'd love to go to sleep, and they can't. There's a lack of concentration. The ability not to be able to do things is huge. When I was really depressed, I could read one of my medical textbooks, and I would start off a paragraph, and I'd get to the end of the first line, and I wouldn't know where I was, and I'd have to start off again. And I'd get to the end of the first line, and I wouldn't know where I was, and I'd have to start off again. And trying to read that same paragraph time after time after time to get it in was so difficult. That's what happens when you get depressed. You have a lack of concentration. You have a sense of emotional flatness. Sometimes you can be irritable. Now this gets people very concerned because they don't understand it. You can actually be anxious and depressed. And the person who is rushing around being terribly anxious about everything may, in fact, be depressed underneath. Anxiety is often the tip of the iceberg. And it's interesting, in about the 60s and 70s, as a profession, we tended to think of anxiety as being a separate thing to depression. Now we don't. Now we tend, generally, to think about a thing called anxiety depression, in which the elements of anxiety and the elements of depression go along a sort of huge spectrum where anxiety is there and depression is there, and the individual sufferer may be anywhere along there. And it's very common now that instead of giving people tranquilizers for anxiety, we give them antidepressants and they get better. You can have a lack of sexual drive, you can have guilt feelings, you can have phobias. It's interesting how often people with really bad phobias can be helped by a good antidepressant. There can be obsessional behavior, checking things, hand washing, feeling of being dirty. You can have, as I said earlier, anxiety which is tied in with irritability. In really severe cases, you can actually hear voices where there aren't any. People think they're going mad if they get to that stage. Usually when you hear voices, it's really either a really severe depression, very severe depression, or it's going on into other areas. You have a low self-esteem. There can often be paranoia, where you feel that people are talking about you, thinking ill of you, acting behind your back. You can have suicidal thoughts. You can also have a fear of committing suicide, which is different from actually feeling like suicide. Sometimes people have a fear of committing suicide. I call it the fear of the fear, like the people who fear that they're going to throw themselves off high buildings or under trains. That's not quite the same as wanting to commit suicide. And also, somebody who tries to commit suicide, you have to differentiate very, very carefully between the parasuicides, those are the ones who just want to draw attention to themselves, and the real suicide attempts, which are the ones who really want to kill themselves. Those are the ones who do not phone the ambulance. Those are the really dangerous ones. You can get bodily symptoms, headaches, backache, palpitations, lump in the throat, sweating, abdominal upsets, and that sort of thing. And the other very important thing is that there is a variation of symptoms during the day in many, many people. So that you may find that you feel horrible in the morning and getting better and better and better until towards the end of the day you actually feel really quite good. And then you go to sleep and it all goes back to what it was before, and you wake up, oh gosh, and you wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning too. And the world is falling in around you and your worries are coming out and oh dear. So that's my sort of set of symptoms of things I personally look for. There is actually a World Health Organization definition which is quite useful. It's sort of the same as the sorts of things that we've just been talking about, but this is in a more set out form. And what you do is you count up how many of these things apply to the individual person. You have to have the first two. You have to have a depressed mood and a loss of interest. But it's a question of how many of these other things you have. Decreased energy, loss of confidence or self-esteem, inappropriate guilt or self-reproach. Suicidal thoughts or behaviour, poor concentration, slowness of action or speaking or agitation, sleep disturbance or a change in appetite. We're going to have some videos of people who have been depressed so that you can get an idea of what it is like, what it feels like to be in a depressed state. Can I give you a warning about these videos? These are all videos of Christians who have had a depression and they have come out of it. Therefore, when you see these videos, you are looking at people who are back to normal, more or less. They are not in their depressed state. Now, that is very important, because if you look at the videos, you can't get an impression that this is what a depressed person looks like. This is not what a depressed person looks like. This is what somebody looks like after they've had the experience of it. One of the interesting things, technically speaking, is that if you ask a depressed person about something, there will often be a characteristic pause at the beginning of the sentence. So if you say, when did it start? When did your depression start? There will be a little pause and they'll say, well, it was such and such. Whereas if they're not depressed, they will start straight away. So when did your depression start? Well, it was about 4 years ago. And I seem to remember that. And can you see immediately that A, there was a space, B, there's a sort of very flat sense of a voice, and you feel almost a sense of lostness with the person. One of the very useful things is to empathise, to emote what you think the person is feeling, and you find within yourself that you often automatically sense their emotions. This is something that we use in medicine quite a lot. If a person makes you feel depressed, they probably are. And that's quite a useful guide. Let's have the first clip. This is Andy's story.
The Graham family is new to this small town in the west of England. For Andy Graham, the change of location and career have played a key part in his recovery from depression. The church they now belong to meets in a local school, and there's a certain irony here because it was Andy's experience as a teacher that led eventually to his illness.
At the time I was head of year in a reasonably large comprehensive school. I had about 160 youngsters who were my responsibility in terms of their pastoral well-being and their academic progress. But I think I just found that there were so many demands on me. I felt I was swimming against the tide constantly in what I was trying to do. Things came to a head over probably a couple of months where Angela, my wife, suggested probably just before Christmas that I maybe go and see a doctor, because she was concerned that maybe I was not coping with life. And within a couple of days of having been at the doctor, I think it all began to sink in, and I just one day kind of broke down at work. I think just realised that yeah, I wasn't coping, that I was depressed, and I needed to do something about it, and that, you know, I'd been prescribed medication and so on. I think that brought it home to me. And I think probably for about 2 weeks after that, I was just quite sort of devastated. I cried and cried and cried, and I think there was kind of a release of lots of kind of pent-up sort of emotions, I guess, but I just couldn't stop crying for about 2 weeks. Church was a real pressure, you know. I was involved in various things in church, but I just wanted to get out. I just wanted to run away. You know, I was okay, you know, if I was in a service, but actually at the end of the service, I just wanted to run. I didn't want to talk to anybody. I just wanted to get out and escape before I had to have any kind of meaningful conversation with anybody. I became increasingly concerned that I was about to completely lose my rag with kids. I completely lost my patience. I'm a very patient person, I think, really. But I increasingly found myself unable to cope with things that I just needed patience for. Getting out of bed was almost too much. I just really struggled to get up in the morning. I think really I just didn't want to get up and face the day, to be honest. I think on top of that, some of the dreams that I was having, I'm not aware of being a particularly vivid dreamer, but in the kind of midst of the depression, I dreamt some vivid, frantic dreams that I sort of woke up kind of breathless and not really knowing quite where all that had come from. I found those dreams just tiring, really. I woke up tired, even though I probably slept longer than I would normally have slept. Life was so incredibly kind of mundane and difficult to find any kind of enthusiasm for it, in spite of the fact that, you know, I got a lovely family with a lovely wife and a good job that was stimulating. I'd always played football for school teams and college teams and so on, and I carried on playing football into my adult life every weekend pretty much. And I just began to find that was just an enormous bind to get myself up and out, to go and do what was essentially something pleasurable. I think I found it increasingly hard to just kind of sit down and get on with things, to prioritise things. I had, you know, quite a heavy workload, and I needed to make sure that certain things were done, and I found that increasingly difficult. I found it quite hard to concentrate on even the sort of simpler things that needed to be done. A typical day would start quite hard, you know. Trying to get up in the morning was murder, and the whole sort of start of the day was yeah, it was pretty grim, I suppose. Mid part of the day was fine. I found things reasonably easy to cope with. I think towards the end of the afternoon, probably tied in with when the kids were getting crabby, I found that really hard to cope with. I found myself needing just to withdraw and get out of the way, because I just couldn't cope with too much of that. And then I guess the evenings were okay. I suppose it just felt reasonably safe, particularly when I had sign-off from work. The start of the recovery probably was actually the diagnosis that actually there was something that I could put my finger on. It wasn't just me not coping. It was, there was, you know, a doctor saying to me, you know, you're depressed, you need to take this medication and wait a couple of weeks for it to take effect, and then see how you go.
Now, Andy is one of those people who had sleep disorders, as you heard, except he was the opposite. He was the person who wasn't refreshed by being asleep. I haven't, unfortunately, been able to get anybody who has experienced the early waking business, which is a shame, because actually I think it's very important. The early waking, to me, if somebody comes up and says, "Doctor, I'm waking up very early in the morning," and they've got a couple of other things, that's the one thing to me that says, hang on, depression, maybe depression. I want now to go on to what happens inside the brain. The brain is a fascinating organ. It has 100 billion nerve cells in it, at the last count. There's a little man sitting there, just got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Oh, 1, 2. And we've revised our estimates. Some people say that it's about 10 billion, some people say it's about 30 billion, but I think most authorities at the moment seem to say about 100 billion cells. Now, nerve cells have got a sort of globular end at one end and a long, thin thing called an axon, and then it spreads out almost like the tentacles of an octopus, and it touches other nerve cells. Those tentacles, well, there's a lot more than 8 of them, because it isn't like an octopus exactly. There are about 10 to 30,000 connections from each cell to other cells. Sometimes lots onto a single cell, sometimes lots branching out onto others. So you work out how many connections that makes. 100 billion times 30,000, well, work it out for yourself. Yeah. Lots. The cells themselves are called neurons. If you're English, you call them neurons. If you're an American, you call it a neuron. The axon is the bit in the cell which is the sort of telegraph wire. What we need to talk about now is the thing called the synapse, and that is where you get the junction between one nerve cell and the second nerve cell. In between the two is a thing called the synaptic cleft. That's where, you've got Dover on one side and Calais on the other side, and the Straits of Dover is the synaptic cleft. Across that synaptic cleft go transmitter chemicals released by the first cell. They jump across the cleft, hit the second cell, lock into some special receptors, and with a sort of lock and key mechanism, which is very specific, open up those receptors and allow certain things to happen. There are all sorts of different chemicals that are involved in this process. You don't really need to know the names of them, but just to give a flavour, here are some of the names. Noradrenaline, 5-HT, which is otherwise known as serotonin, acetylcholine, the endorphins, which are the body's own morphine, dopamine. Here is a cell. Here is the axon going onto another cell. Can you see here there's a bit from a previous cell that says over there? That's a synapse. That's a synapse as well. And in a moment you can see that there is a pulse coming down. It stimulates the synapse. The chemicals inside the synapse are released. They jump across the gap into the synaptic cleft, hit the specific receptors. Here's one about to do it. They go through, and then they activate the nerve cell, and it triggers it off. And the nerve cell triggers like a light switch. It's either on or off. And so this cell has been triggered, and it in turn fires an electrical impulse right down here to the next cell. Now remember that this cell has got, it's not just got one synapse here, it's got 10,000 or 30,000 of these synapses. So it's really connecting, it's firing off large quantities of chemicals. I want to get above anything else in your minds today the idea of this. You have a cell firing electrically. That's converted into a chemical signal which causes the next cell along to fire. So electrical signal, chemical signal, electrical signal. That's the basis of how we pass messages on the brain. In depression, the synapse, the chemicals, don't work as well. Now, I said that the cell would fire. Actually, what the cell does is a little bit of calculation. It works out how many impulses it's had and whether they are stimulatory impulses or whether they are inhibitory impulses, does a quick sum total, calculates the result in its head and decides whether to fire or not. Fires or doesn't fire, and then the messages get passed on. And you may find that you only need a small percentage of the chemicals to be missing for the whole system not to work properly. in which case you might get electrical signal, chemical signal, but it's smaller, nothing. And that's what depression is. That is what depression is. Just a chemical change in the brain. Why do you get that chemical change? Well, there are lots of different potential reasons. It could be that your body isn't producing the chemicals properly. Genetically, you were just one of those people that never produced enough of the chemicals. Or it could be that as a result of some of the things that have happened to you, your body has been working those chemicals over time. So if you've had an anxiety, a stress, a problem, then you've been rushing around within the brain, using all those chemicals up. So you haven't got them for other things. So this is why when people are going for counselling, they can be helped with their depression, because if it resolves problems, then the brain quietens down and then the messages can be passed on because the chemicals are available for other things. It also explains why antidepressants work, because what antidepressants do is stimulate the effects of those chemicals, or what remain of those chemicals, within the sufferer's brain. Now, there are other reasons why people get depressed. You can see immediately that if you've got the problem of these chemicals going across and stimulating the other cells, then if anything else is getting in the way of those cells working, then that cell may not be working as well as it ought to. And here's a whole great list of potential physical causes of depression. Things like thyroid problems, glandular fever. You can get depression after you've had a very bad virus infection, and there's the thought that ME, otherwise known as CFS, disdainfully known as yuppie flu, but correctly known as myalgic encephalomyelitis. There's the thought that that is actually a sort of long drawn-out effect of a virus infection, and it can give you a really depressed state as well. You can get depression with premenstrual tension when the female's hormones are changing with her cycle. You can get general hormonal upsets of other hormones within the body. You can get postnatal depression, which I think everybody's heard about. You get a normal depression after delivery, the sort of 3-day baby blues, but postnatal depression is actually different in that it is something that occurs after that and much more intensely. You can also get food allergies which cause depression, and you can get an idiosyncratic reaction to medicines, and I know that one because I've had it. Cancer can give you a depression just because you've got the cancer, because of the emotional effects of thinking, am I going to die? Radio and chemotherapy can also make you depressed. Alcohol can make you depressed as well. Most people think of alcohol as a pick-me-up. It's not, it's a depressant. But it depresses the bits that are the things that are causing you worry. So to start with, it makes you feel better because it's depressing the anxiety bits. But actually, it's a global depressant. And also, the effects of alcohol in large amounts over time is not good at all. Drugs can make you depressed, especially the anti-anxiety medications. Things like the benzodiazepines. They're very good for anxiety, but if you take them too long and too much, then they can actually have a kickback effect and make you depressed as well. Illegal drugs will do it. Undiagnosed chronic illness, such as hepatitis. And there is the surprising disease called seasonal affective disorder, which goes by the wonderful acronym SAD, which is where you get depressed in about October each year, and then about April you have a little flurry of activity, do all the spring cleaning, rush around and feel an awful lot better. And it is actually related to the amount of light that you get in your eyes. And we have found that if you give people light boxes of a special nature, then it makes their brain effectively wake up a little bit, and they don't get sad as much.
We'll take a break there. When we come back, Dr. Lockley will continue with a description of the various types of depression.